Good, good. Testing, test, 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 test. I'm testing. That's what I'm doing. Thank you. Do you want people to sit in any particular place so it looks fuller from the from that? Like, do you want it coming like? Yeah, you guys want to sit over here? That'd be great. And then I can. And then when the sign language interpreter gets here, assuming she does, I'll know to tell her to stand here and look at that camera. All right. So, and you guys will tell me when to start, or is it? Oh, hi, I'm live. Great. Look at that. Well, we shouldn't start until the president gets here. The president's coming right here. Hey, Felix. President the inaugural, I mean. For those of you who are online right now, we are waiting on a sign language interpreter, but if she isn't here in the next minute or so, we'll just go ahead and get started and hop in when she can hop in when she gets here. We will have, when we post this later on the Center for Disability Ministry website, it will be captioned. I'll just start. I'm Ben Connor. Welcome to Western Theological Seminary. Yay! Wow. You can hear the hundreds of people in person and you guys online as well. I think I could hear that. I'm a professor of practical theology, and I'm the director of the Center for Disability Ministry here at Western Theological Seminary, and I've been here this is year number 9. And a couple years ago, actually right when COVID locked everything down, President Theo Nagraha initiated the opening of something I'd been imagining, which is this Center for Disability and Ministry. We'd been doing some unique things here at Western Theological Seminary. We had already started a graduate certificate in disability and ministry. We had gotten a grant to think through this idea of disabling theological education, and we were starting to get some exciting pieces in terms of bringing on some scholars with a disability who could look at everything from ethics to biblical studies to pastoral care to disability theology, systematic theology. We were starting to build some internal capacity to do some pretty exciting things, and we pulled it all together into this Center for Disability and Ministry. But we didn't launch anything because everything was locked down. And so this is the first event for the Center for Disability and Ministry. And this is the sort of purpose statement of that center. The Center for Disability and Ministry at Western Theological Seminary exists to support ministry leaders of all abilities in nurturing and receiving the gifts and contributions of persons with disabilities through formational opportunities, including theological education, consultation, forums, and publication. So we're starting on all these things. We started with just a graduate certificate in disability and ministry. Now we have a Master's of Arts in Disability and Ministry, and we're finishing up our first ever Doctor of Ministry cohort in disability and ministry. In terms of publications, we have some publications through the Journal of Disability and Religion on disabling theological education, and we have a book series that I'm co-editing with John Swinton on practical theology and disability. The first book in the pipeline is on disabling leadership, written by 3 disabled scholars together. Friendship House also falls under that, and you're going to meet the person who's running Friendship House right now. And then this is the first event that we've had, the first public event. And so what is this event? This is about healing and wholeness. It's about disability in the church. And the 2 presenters are Bethany McKinney Fox. She is a speaker and an author. I got to know her through the Institute on Disability and Theology. I believe that's where we met. Yep, at the time it was the Summer Institute on Disability and Theology. We were able to host it here a couple of years, but that's where I got to know her and continue to grow an appreciation of her ministry and gifts. She is still pastor at Beloved Everybody Church, which is a church that's made up of people with and without intellectual disabilities. They lead and participate in this church together. And her most recent book, Disability in the Way of Jesus, explores how the narratives of Jesus' healing in the Gospels can offer pathways for congregations to be true places of healing, particularly for people with disabilities. So she'll give a 40 or so minute presentation, and then L.S. Carlos Thompson, Dr. L.S. Carlos Thompson, will respond. I emphasize that because that's a recent accomplishment, even though it feels like it could have been a couple years earlier. Not his fault, I will say, not his fault, but in the time between those 2 years, his dissertation gained some biblical teeth. You know, you could put it in the category of systematic theology, practical theology, or biblical studies by the time it was done. A really exciting piece. And so he's the perfect person to respond to Bethany's presentation. He is currently assistant professor of church and community theology. He's director of Friendship House and student accessibility coordinator. And he's working on, and I'm saying this in a public thing so everybody knows so we can keep it on top of him. He's working on a proposal for the series I'm doing with John Swinton with InterVarsity Press, looking at Friendship House, which he could tell you about, I'm sure. Are you going to talk about that? Okay, so he'll tell you about that, and the work of Henry Nouwen. So that is who is here. If the sign language interpreter does show up, we'll make sure that she's here. But for now, let's give a big hand to Bethany McKinney Fox.
I am less tall than Ben. Well, great to be with you. Thanks for coming out. I'm excited to talk about this topic of healing and wholeness. I'm particularly going to focus on Jesus' healing in the Bible and how we can think about that and just unpacking that a little bit. There is a link that I think is going to get put up for folks online and a QR code that is at the front door. If you want to scan that, you can get a copy of my slides that I'm going to be working from. If you don't want to do that, that's also fine. I'll be basically telling you what's on the slides. But if it helps to have a visual cue, that would be great. So as Ben mentioned, I wrote this book, Disability and the Way of Jesus, Holistic Healing in the Gospels and the Church. And the question of why did I write this book? Why did I care about this? So one thing is, if it were not heretical, then I would say my favorite member of the Trinity is Jesus. But if it is heretical, no, I have no favorite. But I just love Jesus, and I have been so, for years, my life has been deeply transformed by reading about Jesus in the Gospels, the way Jesus does things. I mean, I've just found a lot of freedom and life in the life of Jesus. And so, come to find out, as I've gotten more involved in the disability community over time, that a lot of folks I've met with disabilities, a lot of my friends and colleagues with disabilities talk about how often churches and Christians have theologies and practices that are drawing from the healing ministry of Jesus in the Gospels that are really anything but healing in their lives and in the lives of a lot of other folks with disabilities. So for me, as a Jesus lover, I was like, this seems strange that like people who are trying to do this healing thing are actually wounding people. They're trying to be practicing healing in the way of Jesus, and in so doing are harming people. And so I think my question, and this really is the exploration I went on, was, is there a way to take seriously what Jesus is doing in the Gospels and honor the way of Jesus and be followers of the way of Jesus and not do harm to people? And I think that was an open question in a way when I began the exploration. A lot of people have said no to that question, and have kind of just thrown the baby out with the ableist bathwater, or thrown Jesus out with the ableist bathwater. But I'm hoping we can kind of throw out the ableist bathwater and keep Jesus. And I'm kind of just going to be sharing today about a way to think through that, and some ideas about how we can be practitioners of healing in the way of Jesus in our communities and in our lives in ways that are genuinely healing. So, as I kind of embarked on this journey, wondering about this, I think the thing that became clear is that how we read these narratives of Jesus healing in the Gospels is deeply dependent on our own understanding about what does a good body look like? What does a good mind look like? What does healing mean? What does illness mean? What does disability mean? So we have all these predefinitions that obviously we bring with us to the text. And so we read a healing story and we notice the things that correspond with what we already think healing is about. And so what we're going to take some time to do just in our short time today, I'm going to lay out a couple of models of disability and notice how when we look through the different lenses at the text, through these different models, that they kind of tend to both obscure certain things and like uplift other things. And so there's a way that like our pre-understanding comes to the text and allows us to notice or not notice. And so we're going to do a little bit of that together. So I hope that you who are here are up for it. If you don't have the slides pulled up, I would encourage you to pull up the scripture when we get there, and I will give you that reference when we get there. So you'll see on the slide there's an image that I used to illustrate this. This is called a phoropter machine. When you go to the eye doctor and you're getting your glass prescription or contact prescription done, you know they always say, better 1, better 2, 3, or 4. And so it's kind of the illustration to say, depending on what you look through, things appear different. And so that's what we're going to kind of do today is flip a couple of lenses and just notice perception and how that changes. So the first one I want to talk about, and again, for some of you this is going to be very familiar, but I think that it's great to kind of go back to basics. You never step in the same river twice, as the saying goes. Either you're different or the river is different. So let's just step in some rivers. So the first river is the medical model of disability. So who is familiar with the medical model of disability? A number of folks, right? So this is kind of a primary way that disability is defined and understood in this culture and internationally. And the way we think the medical model works is that the location of the problem, I'm using air quotes around problem, is in the body of the individual with the disability. So that's where they're going to see the problem, in the individual. So for an example, like let's think about someone who is blind. According to the medical model, what is the problem? You can say it. Right, they can't see. Their eyes are not like seeing. That's the problem. And let's think about something maybe more non-apparent. So like, let's think about somebody with ADHD or something, a neurodivergence. Where is the problem, in quotes, located? Great. So where is it located exactly? Yeah, exactly, in their brain. So there's some kind of thing in the individual's brain that's keeping them from being able to do certain things, that causes them to do things a certain way. That kind of thing. So the medical model then, obviously, wherever you locate the problem is going to be where you find the solution, right? The hammer is finding a nail. And so if the nail is a problem with the individual, then what needs to be healed are things about the individual. So the method of solution, according to the medical model, is going to be medical treatment, doing genetic research to find a cure, eliminating the disability, having people conform to quote-unquote normalcy. That is not a thing that exists really, but that's the idea, right? That we're kind of taking away whatever the thing is that we think of as the problem in the body or brain of the person with a disability. So like for someone who's blind, what might the medical model see as the solution or a solution? Sure, maybe medication, if that would help, maybe some kind of surgery or some kind of thing that's going to kind of be focused on the individual. And then along with someone with ADHD, since that was kind of our other example, what's going to be the medical model's solution for someone with ADHD? Right, taking some kind of medicine. Great. And there's nothing necessarily wrong about this. This is just a way of thinking about illness and disability, right? And so the thing about the medical model is that it's very individualistic, right? It's focused on the body and the limitations of the person with a disability, both in the problem and in the solution. So if you have your slides pulled up, you're going to see this graphic that I really love that's actually from taxi driver training in the UK. And I don't know why they have such amazing graphics about models of disability in taxi driver training, but when we're done, you'll all be certified taxi drivers. No, that's not true. So in this image, we have a little stick man who's wearing a shirt that says the problem, and there are all these arrows pointing to him that say problem. So it's basically a graphic representation kind of saying, this is the location of the problem in this person. He also is wearing a little frown, in case you didn't see that. And so the traditional view, as it says on the slide, is that disability is caused by physical, mental, or sensory impairments. And so it's the individual who is impaired and is the problem. So that means, again, like we've said, if that's the problem, then the focus of the medical profession is on finding a cure and on alleviating the effect of the impairment. So thinking about that, I'd like us all to imagine that we hold to the medical model of disability. That is our perspective. Let's all put that hat on, the scarf, the medical model accessory of your choice. And we will all be holding that as we read this next text. So I'll go ahead and read it. So if you have the ability to pull up a Bible text, this is Mark chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. They came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. All right, my medical model community. Looking at this text through that perspective, what is the problem? What is Bartimaeus' problem? Through the lens of the medical model. It's pretty straightforward. Great. I know I saw people thinking it can't be that easy, can it? Yes, that easy. So that's the problem. According to the medical model, he is blind. And so if that's the problem, according to the medical model, then what is the solution? What's the healing that takes place? Also straightforward. He restores his sight. Great. So it's a very straightforward way of reading this text. This is kind of the way people tend to read healing texts. And if you look in the scriptures, you know how sometimes there's those bolded headings above different pericopes, different narratives, and it'll just say healing of blind Bartimaeus, blind man gains his sight, Jesus heals blind man, right? It's summed up in this cure that takes place. And so a lot of that is because, we tend to, as a culture, think about illness and disability in very medicalized terms. And so we have this biomedical perspective that we bring to the text. And so we think Jesus is just this fancy doctor, and that's his main thing, is to be like a medical doctor who's just like faster and more skilled, but just like kind of a good medical doctor. And so that's what we end up seeing when we read the text. So great, so that's one way, and what we notice in the text as we come to the text with that perspective. So now we're gonna just look at one other model of disability. There are a ton of models of disability, so this is just one to show kind of a contrast. This isn't necessarily like the best one or like the only other one, but it's just one that's different from the first one. So it kind of reveals how when you have a different understanding of disability and come to the text, just different things are gonna stand out to you. So for this one, this is called the social model of disability. Who's familiar with the social model of disability? Great, some of you. So we'll talk a little bit about what that is in contrast. So the social model of disability is a way of conceptualizing disability that was a while ago developed by some folks in the disability rights community. And like I said, this is one of many models. It's been adjusted over time, evolved over time, all of that, but this is one way of thinking about it. And so in contrast to the medical model that's very like individualistic, the social model locates the problem instead in the systems of social construction, both physical structures like concrete, actual like architecture, physical structures, and relational structures like what are social expectations, those kinds of things. And the institutions that marginalize people with disabilities as individuals and as a group. So it's kind of these external built environment things, social expectation things, and then also stigma. How do we think about people with disabilities? What are the assumptions we have when we meet someone with a disability? Those kinds of things. And that's the location of the problem then, is kind of outside as opposed to inside. So let's think through the social model for a second. If we're thinking about someone who is blind, according to the social model, where is the problem located? What's the problem? And this is for you to answer. And I'll repeat your answer. Exactly, great. So that in society, it's like requires sight. It's built around sight. You need sight to access information, to get around, all these kinds of things. And we've made the world in such a way that it depends on that sense. And so let's think about that with something like a neurodivergence like ADHD. What is, according to the social model, what's the problem, where's the problem located then for someone with ADHD? Great. So expectations, how to sit still, how you do school. Great. There's all these things, you know, like you're 10 years old and you need to like sit down for 3 hours and like not move and stare at this like math worksheet. Exactly. That sort of thing. That there's the way we've chosen. Like that's not the only way to do school, right? And so we've kind of made our environment in such a way that makes certain kinds of things less accessible to certain brains, right? And so according to the social model then, as you can see, the problem is located in a really different place. And so the solution then is gonna also look different. So the method of solution, according to the social model, is that we have this shift in social attitudes. So like we have a more positive attitude about certain traits or behaviors. We don't underestimate the potential quality of life for people with various impairments. And that we focus on, obviously, the accessibility of the physical environments and social environments, social support, like legal protections, civil rights, and that there's access to information in ways that people can understand. So those are kind of the solutions, right? They're the solutions to remove the barriers that are created because we've like built the world in a particular way, both concretely and through expectations and things like that. So that's like what's disabling. So then, according to the social model, what would be the solution for someone who is blind? You can say, you're nodding. Great. Perfect. So that we make things less dependent on sight. I'm repeating it partly for the recording, and so everyone can hear. But so there's less dependence on sight, right? Maybe there's like Braille, maybe there's an audio description. There's just different ways to access that are not just about sight. And then let's think about ADHD. What would be the method of solution according to the social model? Yeah, take breaks, allow people to learn differently, shorter lengths of time, whatever people need, right? So we kind of just change the expectations and way of doing school, various other things. And I want to be clear, this is not like, this is the superior way to think about it. It's really like not one or the other. It's not like you should throw away all medication and only think about this, or vice versa. There's a way that they both just point out different things to us, and they help us notice different things in the text. And so it's not like you have to choose necessarily. It's really like each one actually picks out, it makes it a fuller picture of what we're noticing. So if we just have one, if we just have the medical model, we're missing quite a bit. So this is focused on the role of society and culture in creating barriers and disabling conditions. So you'll see in our next taxi driver image, for our taxi driver training, we have our same little man, little stick man. Now he has a straight face, he's not frowning. And the arrows are pointing outside from him and to the word barriers, because this is where the social model of disability finds the location of disability. It's in the barriers that have been created around, that keep this person from being able to participate fully in whatever it is. So the kinds of social barriers might be that the environment is inaccessible. That could be buildings, services, language, or communication. Obviously, attitudes. I think all of us are aware that attitudes can be just as heavy of a barrier as like a staircase. So it could be prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination. And then organizations can be inflexible in their procedures and practices. And that's also kind of a barrier, is that inflexibility. Obviously, if all of you are church people, you've never experienced an organization that is inflexible. But I'll just tell you, there are some churches that are inflexible, where they don't want to change things. So just know that that's a real thing. So I want us to go back to this text about Bartimaeus in Mark 10. And this time we're going to put on our social model hats, and we're going to read it again. And as I'm reading it, I just encourage you to think about, through this lens of the social model, where's the problem? Where's the change that takes place? What's the healing? That kind of thing. They came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he's calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. So I actually want to just take a minute, whether you're here or whether you are joining us online, and for you just to take a minute or two and look at the text and think through that. Think through, what's the problem that you see? What do you notice? And then what are the healings or changes that you notice take place? So I'm going to be actually just quiet for a minute while you take a minute to do that. All right, so I would love to hear from you. What's a problem that you see in the text as you're looking through the social model perspective? What's one problem? So we already know Bartimaeus is blind, and at the end he receives his sight. We see that that's a thing that happens. What's something else that the text might think is a problem? Yeah, Sarah. Sarah Barton, doctor. Great. So Bartimaeus is located at the side of the road while everyone else is like on this journey. Great. Jesus, the disciples. Great. What else? Great. Folks order him to be quiet, right? And what does the text say? Many sternly order him to be quiet, right? I think we all know what that sounds like. Something along the lines of, shut up, you're a burden, we don't like you, be quiet. What else? Anything else? Yeah, he's a beggar, right? Unlike today, where people with disabilities are thriving in the vocation of their choice, that was sarcastic. Back in the day, obviously this is what Bartimaeus has available to him, right? He's a beggar. Great. Anything else? Great, we'll get to that. No one helped him to get to Jesus. That's true. Great. So let's then move to what are the healings that you see, or what are some transformations that you notice? Yeah. Exactly. So he's no longer at the side of the road. He's like on the way with the crowd. He's part of the community that's following Jesus. Great. What else? What else is different by the end? Yes, this is huge, right? This is, I think, one of those things that we do tend to miss if we think the healing. Oh, sorry, let me repeat what she said. She said that the crowd goes from sternly ordering him to be quiet to saying, take heart, get up, he's calling you, right? And I think this is really important because in the Gospels, this is something that tends to matter to the Gospel writers. They talk a lot about what happens and the reactions of the crowd and how other people are engaged in the story. But when we come with our like biomedical perspective, we think of healing as something that happens between like a doctor and their patient, right? It's very individualistic. There's like a couple of books that there's a chapter in the book that's just about how doctors, like medical doctors, interpret the healing narratives. And I think two of the books, like one is like Jesus MD and one is like Dr. Jesus. I mean, there really is this idea that like Jesus is just like the medical doctor par excellence or something. And so here is something that doesn't have anything to do with that individual patient relationship, right? The crowd is transformed. The crowd goes from, you're a burden, shut up, we don't want to hear from you, to take heart. And it's because of what Jesus does, right? Like, it seems kind of like accessibility-wise, it would be great for Jesus to like go over to Bartimaeus because Bartimaeus is blind. It makes sense that Jesus would walk over. But that isn't what Jesus does, right? The text is clear. Jesus stood still and then said to the people, like commissioned them, call him here, you know? And so he's like bringing about by his actions the transformation of the community. The community is healed in the way that they view Bartimaeus, not as a burden who should stay at the side of the road and be silent, but as someone who they're like welcoming and actually inviting to come to Jesus with them. Great. Anything else that you notice? Great. Well, that's a good number of things that I think we're seeing beyond that. And I think him becoming a follower of Jesus is really important. Something that some people also point to quite a bit is Jesus' question to the man, that when Bartimaeus comes up to him, Jesus doesn't say, here's your sight, right? What does Jesus say? What do you want me to do for you, right? Jesus is like dignifying Bartimaeus by like asking him, what do you want me to do for you? He's not saying, obviously, you're blind, that's what you want. He's making space for Bartimaeus to name what he wants for himself. So that's another thing, right? And Bartimaeus does say, let me see again. I had a student once in an ethics class when we were talking about this text, and he had been a medical doctor. And one word in this text especially stood out to him. I wonder if anybody knows what that word might be. Again, yes. So when he says, my teacher, let me see again, this is something that a doctor would pay attention to because they're thinking about like disease history and like disability narrative and like these kinds of things that have to do with like symptoms. And so he's recognizing, oh, Bartimaeus used to be able to see, but now he can't. And so a lot of folks with disabilities will talk about how that's a really different experience, right? If you're born blind versus you have an acquired blindness later in life, sometimes it's just a different experience, and how you relate to your blindness might be different with a kind of congenital disability versus an acquired disability. Great, so you kind of see the way that as we read the text with different lenses, we notice different things. And again, it's not that one is worse or better, it's just that we want to make sure we're reading the whole text, actually, right? And these details that the gospel writers find to be important because they include them in a number of the healing narratives. If we just come with our biomedical framework, we're kind of throwing those pieces out as like, obviously, that's not part of the healing because we know what healing is. It's curing. And because that's our understanding, right? But that doesn't really seem to be what the gospel writers are going with, because if that's the part that mattered, this story could be like 2 verses long. All we would need to know, Jesus comes to the guy, he couldn't see, then he could see the end, right? There's no reason to include all of these other details if this isn't an important part of what this interaction is about. So I want to talk just a little bit. Hopefully when Carlos and I talk more, we're going to move from just talking about this kind of theoretically to thinking about what does this look like in our lives and congregations. So to do that, we kind of need a little bit of a bridge, because this is something that happened 2,000 years ago in the Middle East, in a different culture, in a very different time. And so to think about us trying to practice what happened there and heal in the way of Jesus today, we need some kind of bridging, contextual bridging. Because obviously, like let's think about John 9 and the man born blind. We would not think that it's, hopefully, if you do think this is great, I'm here to tell you that it's not, that when you meet a blind person, you should spit in the dirt and create mud and spread it in their eyes. Hopefully, this is not something anyone has done or ever will do, but that's like technically what Jesus did, right? So if we're going to be following Jesus, why aren't we just doing that all the time? And the answer is because we're in a super different culture, in a super different time period, really different things mean different things. So you'll see on the slide, and I'll read it to you, this slide about analogical imagination. So this is like a contextual bridging technique that comes from William Spone. He wrote this book, Go and Do Likewise, Jesus and Ethics. And the analogy, which you may recognize from your SAT or GRE days, is the New Testament text is to its world as the Christian community is to its world. So it's kind of needing to take into account context. That it's not just about what Jesus did, it's how what Jesus did interacted with what his culture took different actions and words and things to mean. Because all of that is a part of what Jesus did and how it would be received. So that's also what we have to take into account today. When we do different things, we have to think about how does our context think about things, and how would we do it in a way that then rhymes with what Jesus is doing. So I'm going to read the slide. The action is analogous, not identical. It reenacts the action of Jesus without merely repeating it, right? We're not going to be smearing any mud in anyone's eyes, but we are going to be thinking about how do we capture the Jesus-iness of what's happening without, being harmful. And so it's an exercise in imagination that's based more on finding the rhyme, as in poetry, than finding an equivalency, as in mathematics. It's an exercise of being both faithful and creative at the same time. And both of those words, that's at the heart of what we're doing here with analogical imagination, because we want to be faithful to the way of Jesus. And so that part is important. We want to be able to look at an action and say, oh yeah, that's Jesus-y. It has the Jesus-y aroma, it has the flavor of Jesus, whatever, that kind of thing. We want to sense Jesus in it. But at the same time, we're not going to do a wooden equivalency. And so there's some creativity that takes place in having to imagine, how do we do the thing in a way, in our current context, that is faithful, but then also has that same interaction with our context today. So as an example that William Spone uses in his book, there's a priest, I think in a suburb of Boston, and he has a number of shoe shiners in his church. And it's Maundy Thursday, and so obviously the wooden kind of replication of what Jesus did on Maundy Thursday was wash the feet, right, of the disciples. And so that's what a lot of places do, right? They reenact that kind of, and I have no shade to that practice, but what they did in this congregation was that he shined the shoes of the shoe shiners. That's the priest shined the shoes of the shoe shiners in his congregation. And you can see how there's something about that actually kind of almost better captures what Jesus was doing than this foot washing thing that kind of doesn't have as much meaning in our time. And so shoe shining doesn't either. This book is not super new. No one shines shoes anymore, but you get, it's newer than foot washing, but you get the idea. So that's kind of what we're trying to do here. So I want to just end with going through how, when I think about that, and when I think about what does it look like to have the marks of healing in the way of Jesus today, in our lives, in our communities, in our churches, here are the 7 things that I've outlined. And this isn't necessarily, each one isn't necessarily present in every single healing text, but it's kind of when you read the witness of the Gospels and you look at all the different healing texts, here are 7 things that I think, if you want to ask yourself, is the practice I'm doing Jesus-y? Is there the aroma of Jesus on these things that I'm doing? These are some things I think you might be able to look to and say, are these things true about the thing? Do they bear this mark of healing in the way of Jesus? So the first one, which I very intentionally put first, is that there's a positive reception by the person receiving healing. So like I talked about, part of my kind of impetus for engaging this question is I have plenty of friends, and I'm sure folks here, folks who are watching the recording, people with apparent disabilities, and I've experienced this as well. If you have a body that doesn't conform to what people might expect or want it to conform to, there will be a way that people approach Christians, well-meaning Christians, approach you and just want to offer prayer to you, right? And say, we want you to walk again. We want you to, can we pray for you? And so I've had a number of friends who that's just, and for me too, it's a very unhealing experience, because for a lot of folks, and not everybody, some people, I have a friend who I'll take all the prayer I can get. Whenever you want to pray for me, great. But for a lot of folks, this is not a healing action. It's a way that maybe this person has had to go on quite a long journey of coming to recognize the way that God created their body with intention and the way that God can work through their body as it is. And so this is a journey that they're on. And now all of a sudden, some random Christian in the parking lot wants to say, your body is wrong. And so there's a way that practice just isn't always positively received by the person receiving healing. So is that an example of healing in the way of Jesus? Probably not. So that's kind of the first mark, because when Jesus heals people, you don't see anybody be like, why did you do it, Jesus? I'm so angry. They all are worshiping. At worst, they're kind of neutral. But I would say for the most part, they're praising God and grateful and rejoicing. And so if that isn't what you're experiencing in your community, maybe take a look at it. So the second one, attention to the body and its healing or transformation. So I think it's really easy sometimes to say, oh, if we don't want to focus on curing, then we should just throw out attention to the body in general. And that's not what I'm trying to say either, because Jesus cares a lot about people's bodies. He's constantly touching people, getting in people's physical space. It isn't that Jesus is somehow Gnostic and really just wants you to feel good, but doesn't care about your body. Jesus does care about people's bodies, but the question is whether, as we practice analogical imagination, that means that the practice has to involve cure. And I think there are ways to think about being part of supporting and healing people's bodies that actually doesn't have to do with eliminating the disability or offering a cure at all. Like, it could be even something as kind of indirect as making sure there's access to healthcare. That's a way of like actually caring and nurturing someone's body, but it's not necessarily direct, and it doesn't necessarily involve a cure. It could be massage, it could be a hug if that's something someone likes, right? There's a lot of ways to like care about someone's body and take it seriously without needing cure to be a piece of what you're doing. So the third one, presence with compassion. So this is presence both in terms of proximity, like Jesus just was around disabled people quite a bit, and is that true in our communities? Is there just an actual, just concrete geographic proximity? So just regular presence. But then it wasn't just that. It was a particular kind of presence that Jesus brought to these interactions, right? He was a listener. He was, you can just see the way that he asks questions, the way that he's like, it's a presence with compassion that he brings to these interactions. And then the fourth one, we've kind of already hit on a little bit, that there's the impact and transformation of the broader community. Like, this is not just about doctor and patient. This is about how is the whole community reacting and being transformed? And I think this was one that surprised me going on this journey. And I was like, why do the gospel writers always like include those details? Like, they were angry, they were amazed, they worshiped God. Like, why are we including that as part of the healing? And then just recognizing like, this is just a part of what the healing entails. It entails that the larger community is affected. It isn't something that's just an individual relationship between Jesus and the person. And then fifth, clarifying the identities of the person healed and of Jesus. So, like we see with Bartimaeus, right? His identity was by the community taken to be like, you're a burden. That was his identity. You're a burden who like needs to be silenced. And then through Jesus' action, through that interaction, becomes someone who's like worthy of engaging in a kind way and like supporting in kind of the coming to Jesus and then becoming a follower of Jesus. And Jesus even affirms Bartimaeus as like a person of faith in front of the whole community. And we see that happen a lot too as Jesus uses kinship language. He'll use a lot of like son, daughter, you too are a child of Abraham. He'll use this kinship language to say, these are folks who you might be considering on the outside, but I want to be clear about who they really are, and they're part of my family. They're part of the community of God. And then obviously Jesus' own identity is also clarified as the Messiah. Who is he as someone who expands boundaries, stuff like that. Transformation on multiple levels, so not just the body, but people often become followers of Jesus. They have a spiritual transformation, sometimes a financial transformation, a social, relational transformation. There's all these different things that happen in their lives as a result of this encounter with Jesus. It's much more holistic than just a bodily cure. And then finally, expanding categories and enlarging imagination. And this is kind of my favorite one because I feel like this is like my favorite thing about Jesus, which is like the way he like blows people's minds. And so we see this one happen in the John 9 text especially, but in all of them really, but where the disciples come to Jesus with the question. And what's their question? Right, it's more specific than that. Yes, whose sin was it, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? That's the question, right? So this is their worldview. They have these options. Jesus, is it A, is it B? And then Jesus comes out and is like, it's purple, because he's like, you have these kind of like dichotomy of how you're viewing the world, where it's either this man's sin or it's his parents' sin. But I'm here to tell you it's because of the glory of God is going to be demonstrated in his life. And so Jesus is constantly kind of taking the questions that people ask, taking their idea of who's in and who's out, and expanding their categories and enlarging their imagination. So I have no clock. Hopefully that was about the right time. But that's the gist of what I have to say, and I would love to hear from my colleague.
Thank you, Bethany. So Bethany and I have interacted off and on for, I want to say, 3 years, 4 years, but we've never actually met in person. So this is a first because of COVID and a lot of other particulars. Maybe I'll just pick up right where Bethany left off with this story of a man who is born blind, and he is kind of existing in a context that very clearly has some defined categories and presuppositions that go along with being born non-optically sighted. So there's this thing called stigma that's just thick in the Hebraic worldview and the early world of antiquity. And it comes out of this thing, there's this fancy word called physiognomy. Physiognomy essentially is your body physically displays how the rest of you is spiritually. Because in this world view, the living person is seen as sort of a cohesive whole. And so we have a lot of kind of body, mind, soul dualism in the Western philosophical worldview that we espouse. And there's a lot of threads to pull out here, so don't hear sort of a one-to-one comparison in what I'm saying. But in this kind of early world of antiquity and the world where Jesus is sort of interacting with his interlocutors, there's a more cohesive understanding of the human person. And so the debate around what happens when you die, that's real, right? That debate was strong. But in terms of how you function as a living person before the afterlife is in question at all, there was a huge amount of consensus that the person is a cohesive whole. So what I see physically displays what you are internally, spiritually, emotionally, and so on. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind when we sort of dive into this story of the man born blind. But the other piece is that the person was not just the individual. There was also this communal aspect of what it was to be a human being and be a person. And so there's sort of your body and your spiritual well-being, but also your communal well-being and your communal body. And so you see this in all the different healing narratives when, as Bethany pointed out, the authors are very clear about the exclusiveness and the exclusivity that's being experienced by these individuals that are being pushed to the margins, right? And it's because their physical body and their physical state is then sort of pointing to a spiritual brokenness, a spiritual uncleanness, a justification for rejection, right? So when we read in the text this idea of a man born blind, it's assumed that the readers already know the Jewish context, which basically says in, say, for example, the Temple Scrolls, that this is so impure that blind people shouldn't even be allowed to enter God's holy city lest they profane the presence of God, right? And so this is sort of an accepted cultural assumption, right? And so the man born blind sitting on the side of the road, or Bartimaeus sitting on the side of the road as a beggar, and the crowd says, "Step aside, we don't want to hear from you, you're in the way, you're inconvenient." Very normal, very understood, and it's because physically they're observing one thing and spiritually making assumptions, okay? Hence the question, why is this man born blind? Was it his sin or his parents' sin, okay? And Jesus says, it's purple, right? That's one way to read it, but the other detail there is Jesus says neither, but so that the glory of God would be shown. Okay, if you read this with the medical model in mind and you kind of map a 21st century Western worldview onto this, then the work of God that's shown has to be that this man was born blind. Jesus spits in the mud, makes some dirt, or spits in the dirt, makes some mud, rubs it on his face, and then he's healed. Okay? However, step back a bit historically. So there was a man named Irenaeus, who's known better as Saint Irenaeus, and history tells us that he was mentored by a man named Polycarp, who was mentored and discipled by St. John, who wrote the book of St. John. Okay? Irenaeus reads this passage and says, the works of God that are shown in this passage, it's better to translate this as, this is a man who was born without eyes. not, this is a man who's simply born blind. And then he sort of takes that and says, here's why I say that. The works of God that are being shown, Jesus is taking mud and making eyes. And then in that moment saying, do you see that I am the same one as the one who breathed life into humanity in Genesis? I'm doing the same act, creating humanity from mud. That's the work of God, to display Jesus as God. It's so not about whether or not this man is blind. Now, according to history, this man actually does have a name, and he becomes better known in history as Saint Celadonius. So Celadonius, being born blind so that the works of God would be shown in him, according to Saint Irenaeus, receives this narrative as saying, the man was born without eyes so that Jesus would step onto the scene of human history and say, do you see me as God? So in some ways, there is a certain amount of, it's important what model you use to read these texts, right? And hermeneutics in a contemporary sense does matter. However, when you look more closely and critically at both the context and history, but also the language that's used, you begin to see things like there is a historical grounding that then says you can make a really strong case for the fact that this sort of ableist disability has to be a negative way of reading the text. It's a dangerous assumption to make. There are other things that we can talk about, like, for example, maybe what Jesus is doing is drawing together the person and restoring each aspect of the person, because what Jesus cares about is being shalom with flesh on. And so this sort of idea of a broad, sweeping, cosmic, far-reaching restoration that brings the God of shalom out of the temple into the midst of the people and then says, come to me. And this reaches all the way back to the way that shalom would have been understood in Old Testament context through the words of the prophets and the Messiah that they were waiting for and the expectations they placed on kings that were never met. And the fact that it was assumed if you live a life that honors God, then you will obey the king and the king will restore shalom. But this never happened. And then Jesus steps onto the scene and begins to fulfill shalom in a very, very different way. And you can make a strong case that that's what healing is pointing to. It really doesn't have a whole lot to do with whether or not your physical body functions a particular way. So, from here then, it makes sense to say if healing is something that actually has more to do with revealing Christ as God, and then that same God looking at the people that everyone else says have no business being close to God, and Jesus says, come to me. If that's what healing really does, then it makes sense that you begin to see some of the details that Bethany pointed out, where Jesus is actually beckoning each person or each constituency within a healing narrative to himself. You see the crowd that's pushing one man away, and then Jesus says to that same crowd, bring him to me, and then overturns their social assumptions and therefore restores a communal relation between this man, the crowd, but then also this man is now seen as whole and restored and welcomed back into the temple, and so on and so on. So what it does then, in sort of a broad stroke sense, is Jesus is modeling for us healing is by nature communal and restorative. The individual matters. Jesus never loses sight of the individual. However, shalom is global and communal as well. And so what does that mean then for us? If we are to be people who go and heal the sick, and we walk in the steps of Christ, but we don't just make assumptions about the actions of Christ and then do what we think he did, like, spit in some dirt, make some mud, rub it on people's faces. Bad idea. But when we look at maybe why Jesus was doing what he was doing, we can model that in some ways. And I think for us, as Christians, people who love Jesus, people who desire to model Christ, and people who are part of the body of Christ in the church, when we're called into the ministry of healing, if we look carefully at the actions of Christ, I think what we wind up at is the ministry of healing is by nature then calling those who are rejected or marginalized or excluded into the community of Christ, and then in that community you begin to see their giftedness in the Spirit. And in that exchange, it becomes a sort of reverberating, do you see God? Do you see God? And so it's not so much about like one body functioning like some weird ideal or average that couldn't possibly exist. It's more about this sort of communal act of individuals being brought near and then touched by and restored by the living, breathing, pulsing presence of shalom. And in that action then, everything is transformed. So I guess a question that would be good to transition with then is, how do you bring that into a practical space where you can say, how do we then as people live that out? And Bethany and I exist in different spaces. We do different things. We interact with different people, but we have some common convictions and some common ways of sort of living out some of these beliefs. And so I think, if you're all right with it, maybe we'll just dive a bit into explaining how these convictions have feed on, as it were, in our various contexts. You should go first. Yeah.
Thank you. It's great. Yeah, the shalom piece is super helpful. So yeah, I think it is important for all of us to not just kind of be in the realm of ideas, but to think about how does this actually look concretely. So I appreciate you taking us there. My current context is I'm a pastor of Beloved Everybody, which is a community in Los Angeles that started about 5 years ago. And it's a community where people with and without intellectual disabilities, as well as neurodivergent folks and people with no connection to disability hardly at all before they came to the community, all kind of lead and participate all together. So, sorry, I have this mint that is really poking me. Got it, there, okay. So anyway, in some ways, the impetus behind starting this community was the reality that thinking through some of these things about revealing who Jesus is, and then doing this part you're talking about the shalom, particularly to people who are being left out on the margins, that kind of thing. And the way a lot of our church practices and the way we do church together often is, in some communities, this is really different. The Christian community is so broad that I hate making these like sweeping statements, but I'm about to make one. So in a lot of places, it's just really wordy and really cerebral. So you come in, you sing some words, and then you pray some words, and then someone says a bunch of words at you, and then you pray some more words, and then you sing some more words, and then you leave. And so it's just and it's not, that's like way overly simplistic, but you get the idea that sometimes it can feel like there's just like a wall of words coming at you. And for people who connect to God better in other ways, or for whom that's inaccessible, that isn't necessarily like a great way to be in community, in a worshiping community. And so I think what I was thinking about is, what would it look like to create a community that made space, not only in the way that we gather and worship, but also in what we think leadership means, and how people are given space to share their gifts. Churches tend to be quite narrow in the kinds of gifts that are uplifted as valuable, right? They tend to be very upfront gifts, like if you're very smart in a certain way, if you're really articulate, if you have a degree, if you're a really good musician, some kind of like performative type thing tends to be what churches really value and uplift. So I think my question was, part of what it means to heal in the way of Jesus as a community is, and this connects to a number of different ones, right? Clarifying who Jesus is, clarifying who people are. You can't really know who people are if there isn't space in the community for them to be themselves. And so that means like just basic accessibility. And it also means that the way you do things as a community makes space for people who move in different ways, who use language and don't use language, all those kinds of things. So I think for me, it was an issue then of how do we create a community that takes all of that seriously and wants to welcome the kind of beautiful diversity of bodies and brains that God has created. And that's part of what it means to be a community of healing in the way of Jesus, is accessibility. Like, I think sometimes people think accessibility is this like option, that our church isn't called to that. But it's kind of like, well, actually, if we're followers of Jesus, we're kind of called to welcome the people that exist in the community, and that's a real diversity of bodies and brains that exist. And so accessibility is a part of healing in the way of Jesus. And so those are just some beginning thoughts. We want to leave some time, too, for discussion or comments, so I'll just say that much right now, and I'd love to hear about your context.
Yeah, that's actually really helpful. Shake some things loose. Some of the things that I heard from you were sort of diversity is actually not a bad thing. And so what does it look like for Christians to live in such a way where we're actually living into the value that diversity is an expression of divinity and a part of being created by God, rather than difference or disability equaling deficiency, right? So in our sort of secular context outside of what we would hope the church to be, we often we hear disability and we think deficiency, right? Or even you could stretch it a bit, and I would say this is more accurate. We look at something that's different than how we perceive ourselves to be, and we say deficiency, right? And so when you find yourself in communities where the assumption is everybody here is called by God, everybody here is drawn near to God, and everyone here is then gifted by God, what does it look like for us to live into that, right? Then you're doing ministry with people rather than always doing ministry for people, things like that, right? So in my context, I serve as the Friendship House Community Director here at Western Theological Seminary, and my wife and I and our daughter also live in that community. And that phrase, different doesn't equal deficient. Different is an expression of diversity, which is an expression of divinity. We say that all the time. And one of the reasons is because we use this word normal. It's thrown around a lot, right? Well, there's a gentleman who's kind of a household name here that's really good friends with many of the people in this room named John Swinton. And he has this little section in a really good book that he wrote called Becoming Friends of Time, where he kind of critiques the idea of the average and said, okay, if you know anything about statistics and averages in the bell curve, you realize that the actual average can't possibly exist in the exact sense. It's a conglomeration of a bunch of different things that are then smushed together to create this idea of an average or normal. And so he's like, first of all, it doesn't exist, right? But then sidestep that a bit. Let's just pretend on some level that there's a category of normal. Okay, we, by virtue of being human beings, have a beginning because we're created. We have an end because we're created, which means we have to be sustained in the middle. We're not self-sufficient, which means all of us have needs and all of us have limits. So in the very basic sense then, doesn't that mean that the normal way of being as a creature is actually to have needs? And maybe, just maybe, this is based on a conversation I had with a resident who lives in our community. An article was just published. I can tell you about it later, and you can read the story, so I'm going to condense it. But we're having a conversation, and he threw out this idea, and he said, so I basically used to not like you because we were so different. And then I got to know you, and I realized we are different, but I learned things from you, you learned things from me, and that's actually a beautiful thing because we need each other. And then he said, maybe that's why God creates us with needs, so that we actually live into needing each other. So maybe the normalcy that the body of Christ leans into and actually living into this brings healing is saying, I have needs, and that's actually a gift. And so we stop looking at this weird sort of spectrums and saying, okay, if you're just to the left or just to the right, you're fine. But if you're 5 notches further than that, then all of a sudden it's too much need, and we call that a disability. There are some medical benefits to that, but in the world of the church, And a world that's permeated by this call and conviction of shalom, that shouldn't be our barometer. So for my context, the Friendship House is really committed to living into the idea that needs are necessary. And it sounds like we're similar in that way. So, anyway.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing, and then we're happy to take some questions, both from folks here and people watching from the comfort of wherever you are, or the discomfort, wherever you are. And I'll just add that when you're saying that thing about need, I just want to add that I think that accessibility piece is part of acknowledging that we have needs, right? And so it's like making sure that, like we talked about, that things are multisensory, right? You're not just relying on hearing, you're also having some kind of embodied way of engaging God. You're having some kind of verbal, but also maybe visual, also maybe embodied, and there's like options, and none is really better or worse than another, right? It's kind of like, so that's a really important part of the way that we do things is there's going to be a number of options for how you can engage a particular activity. And I feel like sometimes when I go to like a yoga class or something like that, it'll be like, here's like the right way to do it. But if you can't do it that way, you can do this other thing that's like your special way. And there's a way that's like clearly the worst way. Like that's clearly like, if you can't do this right way, here's like your special way. And there's a way that, okay, but there's a way that it's clear to me or other people who maybe aren't doing things the normal way, that it's a worse way. And so I think it's an important thing in a church community, and any community really, but especially one that's kind of trying to say, we believe in like kind of the dignity and gifts and value of everyone here, and the fact that we all have needs, that you can participate in this by sitting, you could kneel, you could stand, you could do whatever, but to kind of give options, and that's just an embodiment one, but that's true of everything, right? And so that's actually a way of kind of like, a kind of concrete way of acknowledging we all have needs, we all have limits, we all have ways that we engage best. So just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, there's a simple phrase that you hear a lot in the Western community and in some local churches in our community, but when it comes time to rise for worship, there's this little phrase, listen for it next time, because people in my position tend to hear it. Now, I don't get angry, and decide to leave the service if I don't hear it, but I notice it when I hear it, and that's please rise in body or in spirit, right? That second part, or in spirit, is a recognition of the fact that there are some people in this space for whom rising in body might be extremely painful and therefore very distracting and actually take away from their ability to connect with God or participate. There are many examples, but little turns of phrases like that, right? Acknowledge the diversity of needs or particulars.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So now I think we have some time for some questions, and Ben will be...
I don't really need to moderate. You guys can do it.
I think they need... Oh, how much time do we have?
We don't have super long.
10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
We don't have the capacity, unfortunately, to receive the questions online.
Oh no.
So
Sorry.
Oh, okay.
I'll let you guys.
But we have, I think to get on the recording, they just need to use this mic. So I think there was a question.
Hi. I really appreciate this talk, and I've been thinking a lot about these things. And I think it's so important that we talk about the social model of disability, and we think about structures that must change, and inaccessibility, and all of that, systemic ableism, all of that. And my reluctance sometimes is that we make more stigma for those who might get a diagnosis and grieve, or have an accident, have a sudden disability, or are caregiving and it's tough, or live with chronic pain and would give anything to be healed, right?
Sure.
So how do we leave room for the grief that is real for some people, right?
Yeah.
And not say it's
Amen.
all the society, it's all the
Right.
system. Because especially as as a person who lives with depression, like, I need my medication, right? And so there's enough stigma out there that says
Yeah,
you shouldn't
for
take
sure.
meds. There's
For
nothing
sure.
wrong with you, or what's wrong with you? Why are you going to the doctor for that? Why are you going to therapy? So I guess my fear with the social model is that we say the medical model's not okay, and that it shames people who are looking for help anywhere they can get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
For sure. For sure. I mean, do you wanna respond first, or should I?
Go ahead.
So I think you're spot on when you mentioned sort of what I hear is the medical model provides a certain landing point, right? And the social model provides some serious benefits that are needed, right? So we're choked by time constraints, right? Bethany's exactly right when she says there's a whole bunch of models. They've been unpacked for years. If you're interested, there's a gentleman by the name of Tom Shakespeare, who is kind of European. I think he's Irish. Is that right? Irish? English? English. He writes a book called Disability Rights and Wrongs. The second edition of that book, if you open at the beginning, he just unpacks models in all kinds of detail. But then he arrives at this idea of what he calls a hybrid model that essentially acknowledges the realities of the medical model and then acknowledges the benefits of the social model and says, okay, here's the thing. Bodies sometimes can suck. And so being disabled is a real thing and gives access to medical care and treatment and a better understanding from people when you can receive a diagnosis. But the social model then also challenges the social structures, right? So I think you're right on that. And I think for the church to be faithful, we need to acknowledge the fact that suffering is complex. And when suffering occurs, there's sort of micro or macro fractures in the person. And attending to the realities of the medical model can help us to sit with people and come alongside of people that are in very real pain and suffering. But it also can help us to pump the brakes a bit and not assume that we know everything about what is and is not suffering, right? So I guess as a direct answer, I would say we ought to adopt a kind of hybrid model that says medical realities are realities. And social stigmas are also social stigmas. And how do we as people say, Shalom actually addresses both of these things and is willing to sit with and be attentive to people when the answers aren't coming. So. Yeah, Tom Shakespeare. Yeah, and the book is Disability Rights and Wrongs. There's a couple editions. The second edition is the clearest that I have found for understanding the models. And that's like all of them. I mean, European, Americans, yeah.
And I'll just add just one small thing. That basically gets at it. And the one thing I'll just add is that this is very individual. We're talking in the abstract right now because we're talking about healing conceptually. But as it actually takes place in communities, it's very much in conversation with actual people who have actual bodies and actual experiences, and that all is part of the conversation. And I feel that's a really important piece.
Yeah, the what is it that you want me to do for you
Right.
question. Right, it's really important.
Yeah.
Either Jesus was asking an honest question or he was lying. So
Right.
that matters on some level,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I was just talking to some MFT students about this a couple of days ago, Future Therapists of America. And they were, one of them was like, well, how do we pray for people then? And I was like, you just pray for what they ask you to pray for. Maybe they ask for a cure. Okay.
Yeah.
God is wildly free. God can do what God wants to do. But it's but it is that relationship that's a really important piece that we don't, I appreciate, thanks for bringing that up. Any other thoughts or questions?
As a person who lives with disability, I want to point out there's a difference between helping and healing, especially. I've noticed in a church, not my church, but churches in the past, they want to heal your disability, but mine has no cure. And so, I feel people should know there's a giant difference between helping someone and healing someone, and that, like, through that conversation you guys had earlier, I thought about that.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah.
And I would even say, too, there's a difference between curing and healing, and that someone can be, like, uncured, but also healed, because there's, like, something else that's happened.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what you mean by helping, right? Yeah, that's such a good point.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, super good point. Yeah.
Anything else? Oh. Or cured but not healed, you mean?
Just the
The
opposite, of
opposite,
what you were
exactly.
saying.
You
Yeah.
could be cured and not healed. Exactly. That's
Yeah.
great.
If you're curious, the narrative of the woman who had sort of this continual flow of blood, if you look at shalom and the concept of shalom in that narrative, in the last line of the narrative, Jesus uses 3 different words that all tie back to the word shalom in the Old Testament, and they point to healing. But the way he uses them point to 3 different types of healing that occurs. But in the beginning of the narrative, the woman wanted one type, and she didn't get that one type until Jesus beckoned her, she responded, and he declared it over her. So you can be cured in the bodily medical sense, and you could argue maybe from that text, not healed. That's sticky.
I want to add one other thing that I forgot to do at the very beginning. Sorry, Ben. I didn't do a visual description of myself as I started. Should we do that right now?
I didn't either.
So, yeah, it slipped my mind. I apologize that I'm doing it at the end, but at least now you'll know, and you can re-listen or watch and know what I look like. So I am a pale-skinned person. I have brown hair with bangs. It's pulled up. I'm a larger woman, short though, and wearing a black dress with a yellow cardigan and a little harmonica necklace that you might not be able to see, but it's pretty great, and some red shoes.
I wanted to know what the necklace was. I just never asked. Now I know. I am a tan-skinned, mixed race man with black curly hair. I'm wearing a blue cardigan, gray pants, brown shoes, and I walk with crutches, arm crutches, forearm crutches.
So that should have been at the beginning. We'll just cut and paste, and it'll be great.
And he's a handsome dude who always dresses well, particularly compared to me, who does not dress well. I'm just a big, bald white dude. So Carlos isn't done yet, because one of my favorite things about Carlos is not only his academic rigor and his compassion at Friendship House and his Friendship House, sort of his friendship, but also his pastoral sensibilities. Everything he does is done as a pastor. So would you close us in prayer?
Yes.
Thank you.
Father, Son, Holy Spirit, thank you for the opportunity to share some moments together. Thank you for the gift of your word. Thank you for the gift of calling us your people, giving us purpose, and sending us into a world to continue your work through your Spirit. Thank you for the gift of partnership. Thank you that we are created with purpose and that needs connect us to live into that purpose. Thank you for Bethany and her willingness to share some time with us. Thank you for each person in this room. I ask that you would fill us with your Spirit, that we might have a stronger desire for you and a stronger desire to be faithful to the work that you've called us to and to love others faithfully in return. Thank you for all that you've done for us and all that lies ahead of us. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Again, thank you for being here. A reminder to everyone, this will be posted on the Center for Disability Ministry website, and we'll continue to put resources up there. And when it's put up there, even though our sign language interpreter wasn't able to make it for some reason, which we'll find out later, it will be captioned. So thank you all for being here. Have a blessed evening. Good night.